Esta noche, el 1 de noviembre, celebramos Día de los Muertos. Día de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, is a celebration that captures a unity between life and death. It emphasizes death as part of the cycle of life. Came into being when the Catholic Feast of All Souls Day, a day to remember the dead with prayer, merged with Indian rituals of death after the Spanish conquered Mexico in 1521. El Día de los Muertos is celebrated on November 1st, when it is believed that the spirits of dead relatives return to their homes. For this special occasion, altars are cleaned and decorated on October 31st to welcome the honored guests. On these altars, one traditionally places sempachulis, yellow marigolds, candles, toys, religious pictures, cut tissue paper decorations, and personal mementos as offerings to the returning souls. Other offerings include incense, cigarettes, liquor, and foods such as tamales, candles, sugar skulls, and pan de muertos, things the returning soul enjoyed during life. At around 4 a.m. on November 1st, the spirits of the children are expected. They are expected for only a few hours, and around 8 a.m. their departure is marked by the blowing out of tiny candles and their removal from the altar. At about 3 p.m., the spirits of the adults arrive and large candles are lit. It is said that the spirits will go away weeping if nothing is offered to them. Prayers are said at the altar around 8 p.m., and everyone attends Mass at church on the morning of November 2nd. In the evening, they will fill the cemeteries where graves of the departed relatives are cleansed and cleaned and decorated with cempasúchil. Once their incense is burned and food is offered until dawn. On November 4th, the altars and decorations are removed. The dead are seen as guests of honor, as a family reunion, national affirmation. Here's a quote from Horcacistas 137. For all eternity, muses an old man, my descendants will remember me, and on the eve of every 2nd of November I will come back to them. I will find a house filled with food, incense, the light of candles, and warmth, and I will come in, and forever and ever, that one night of the year, I will be among my own. Traditionally, you set up an altar called an ofrenda. The ofrenda, Spanish for offering, is a home altar decorated for the Day of the Dead celebration to honor and please the returning souls. The altar is decorated with pictures, candles, and food such as tamales and candies as an offering to the returning soul. The altar has 3 levels. On the first one, the dead greet their relatives. On the second one, they enjoy the banquet. The third level is a holy place of the divine. On the Tlaxcalteca offering, 2 earthenware skulls are included to symbolize death, but not like something terrifying, rather death as a different dimension of life itself. And there are certain things you put on the ofrenda or the altar. I'm going to go through a bunch of different things and the explanations of them. You will find papel picado, tissue paper cutouts. Tissue paper banners with cutout designs of animated skeleton figures adorn altars and homes during El Día de los Muertos. The art of making these banners was similar to leather tooling. Today, half the fun is in cutting out the tissue paper with scissors and creating one's own design. Candles or velas, beside their religious symbolisms, are placed on ofrenda to light and to guide the ways of the soul to the altar. The cempasúchil was the symbolic flower of death to the Aztecas. Perhaps this association was made because once the marigold is cut, it dies very quickly. For this reason, flowers on the ofrenda referred to the earth and the regenerative forces of nature. Also, in some regions, marigold petals are strewn to create a symbolic pathway leading the souls to the ofrenda. Incense is burned on grave sites and on the ofrenda. Its perfumed smoke surrounds the altar and grave, providing an atmosphere of mystery. The transformation of earth matter into something ethereal is symbolic transformation of the physical to the supernatural, which is associated with the death of the returning soul. You will find un vasito de agua, a glass of water, to quench the thirst of the returning souls after their long journey. This emphasizes the fact that water is the main support of life. Sugar skulls, calaveras, are made from sugar paste which has been pressed into ceramic molds. These skulls are decorated with flowers and the scrolls of coloring icing and metallic-colored foil. The skulls bearing the name of the returning soul are used in the ofrenda, but can also be given to living children as treats in exchange by sweethearts. The consumption of the skulls by the living is done to associate pleasant sensations with their symbolic deaths, and also to understand that in the end, death will feed on the living. Pan de Muertos. Pan de Muertos is a sweet bread flavored with anise, orange peel, and orange glaze, specially made to be placed on ofrendas and graves. The breads are baked for both the living and the dead and come in many different animal and angel shapes. More traditional loaves are round with a central raised knoll of dough, representing the skull, and crossbone-shaped decorations radiating from the central knob. Juguetes, Day of the Dead toys, are a variety of toys such as painted clay skeleton figures, which portray the dead resuming their normal activities such as playing cards that one can purchase and put on the ofrenda. Pool toys and crank boxes with similar death imagery are given to children to introduce them to the idea of death in an atmosphere of joyful celebration. So the difference between the European thought of death and the Mexican thought of death is very different. Mexicans see it as a way of celebrating dead and having a reunion with the dead, whereas the Europeans see death as, well, you just die and you go away and we never see you again. But here it's a little different. The ghosts return to the world of the dead, encouraged by masked mummers whose mission is to scare away any stubborn souls who try to linger too long. Thus are the living and the dead left at peace with each other for another year. But it's not really like that. That's the European way. And it's a way for just people to come and just celebrate the spirit of different people. So tonight, if you are thinking of loved ones who have passed on, tonight is the night when traditionally they would come and they would visit you. And don't get espantados, don't get all escamosos, don't get all scared, don't believe that, hey, you know, the ghosts are going to come and they're going to spook me out. It's nothing like that. The belief is definitely that you should not forget the loved ones who have died. You cannot forget those who have come and gone. You can't just, forget pretend as if they never existed at all. Remember them. Remember the good times you had with them. Remember all the funny things and all the things you have done. Don't forget the people who have died. Celebrate the death. Because death and the belief, whether you happen to be Cristiano or whether you happen to believe in these traditional beliefs, death is just one level of existence. There are several different levels of existence, and death is one, living is another. So tonight we're going to be talking about Dia de los Muertos. We're going to be reading some ghost stories, and we'll be back and we'll talk a little bit more about the different rituals and things that are performed in different areas, between Mexico, between the United States and Central America. So stay tuned. Estamos celebrando Dia de los Muertos, and if you've got some loved ones, and if you got a little altar in your house, and I know your abuelitos always have that little altar, just go and light a candle, man. Just go and light a candle right now, and just say a little prayer to those who have departed, and salute them. Let them know you're thinking about it. Gather round the radio. Get your blankets, get your children, gather round. Let's tell ghost stories. I'll be reading tonight from a book entitled Mexican Ghost Stories of the Southwest, as compiled by Cat Avila. The first story is a story that we all know, that we've all been told, that we've all been scared with. The tale of La Llorona. A long time ago, in the old days, there lived a woman in Mexico. Life was hard for her because her husband had died and she was left with 3 small children. In time, the children became a burden for the woman. She longed for the gaiety and the dancing at the fiestas as an escape from her daily responsibilities. For this reason, the woman would go out and leave the children to fend for themselves, and because they were hungry and hurt from the beatings they received at her hands, the children cried often. One day, tired of hearing her children's endless weeping and pleading for food, the woman forced them into a sack and dragged them to a nearby river swollen from the rains in the mountains. Although the children cried out to their mother, begging them to release her, they did not suspect the grim fate that she had in store for them. As the woman dragged the sack slowly to the water's edge, she could hear her children cry out, "No, Mama, please, no." Still, she was determined to cast off the yoke that hung around her neck because her heart was hard and cruel. Oh, to be rid of these troublesome children, she thought. Finally, the mother pushed the sack off the bank into the river with one quick move. She could hear her children's terrified screaming as they tumbled into the swift, swirling rivers that swallowed them into eternity. Afterwards, the woman walked away happy. At last, she was free. The woman continued her loose, wicked life until she finally died. Her soul was taken before God for judgment. Trembling and sorrowful, she stood before the Almighty. "You," God said to her, "are to be pitied. Not only have you sinned greatly during your time on earth, but you committed the greatest sin of all. You killed your own children. Therefore you are condemned to roam the rivers of the world until you find their bones. You will find no rest until then, and you will wander about crying until the end of the world." So if some night, when there is no moon, and you happen to hear a long, mournful, howling cry by the river, beware. It may be La Llorona, the wailing woman, looking for her children. Stay away from the river, because you don't want her to find you in the dark. The next story is El Hijo Malcriado, the bad boy. Many years ago, somewhere in the lowlands of the Sierra Madre Mountains, there was a remote village. Life was hard for the villagers who lived on the edge of starvation. Many managed to barely survive by selling the firewood they gathered in the surrounding hills to the people of a nearby town. With this, they earned a few coins they used to buy maíz for their tortillas and a handful of frijoles. On the outer edge of the village in an old adobe house lived Enrique, a 16-year-old boy and his mother. Enrique had worked hard collecting wood and selling it to the townspeople for their cooking from the time he was 8. By now, with no improvement to his life and every day the same grueling routine, he was getting tired of his daily chores. His mother was old and could do nothing more than sit in the house and cook the meager daily meals and pray before the family altar. His father had died when Enrique was very young. Every morning, Enrique would rise early, grab his machete, and head to the hills to cut wood. By the end of the day, the weight of the heavy bundles bit into his shoulders, bruising them. Still, the will to survive is strong, even for the poor, and it kept Enrique going. The boy would dream, to run away to the big city of Chihuahua. Enrique had heard stories about the city from those friends of his who had been lucky enough to attend a large festival of the day held there every year. But he had never had the money for the trip, and as it was, sometimes he could barely manage to feed himself and his mother, and she was beginning to get on his nerves. "What a useless old woman," he would say to himself. "She's like a flea on my skin. All she does is sit at home while I work hard chopping and gathering wood to sell in town in the heat of the merciless sun. Then when I get back home, I have to go down to the village fountain to fill the water jars." One day he decided that he would not go out and work. His mother begged him to do his daily chores. "Please, hijo, por favor," she pleaded with him. One day her whining tone aggravated him more than usual. He was tired of her crying and uselessness. Enrique raised himself up and kicked at his elderly mother. Her face was suddenly covered with fear. He yelled at her, "I'm sick of your ugly face. I'll fix you once and for all." He took his machete in his hands and started to hack at her. She did not even have time to scream. Horror was etched on her face as he cut her down with one deadly slash. Blood flew on the walls and fell on the dirt floor as he hacked her once, twice, 3, 4 times before his rage calmed down. Enrique walked over to a shelf and took a small bag that held a few coins. He put them in his pocket. Then he went out of the adobe house and headed for a nearby river to wash the blood from his hands and his clothes. "Once I clean myself up, I'll head for the city of Chihuahua," he laughed. Upon reaching the bank of the river, he took off his clothes and washed himself. He then began to wash off the fresh blood from his garments. The trail of blood flowed in short stringy threads as it rippled and swirled away in the water. Enrique squatted on the bank with the morning sun warming his wet body. He slowly stood up to leave. To his surprise, his feet were stuck to the sandy soil. He strained to break loose, but to no avail. He cried and he screamed for help. Some of the village people came. They pulled to break him loose, but they could not move him. He sank to his ankles. Later on during the day, they discovered the boy's ghastly deed. He had killed his mother. In Mexico, one of the most unforgivable crimes is to kill your mother or your father or both parents. Even the beasts in the wild do not commit such brutal acts. And as the days went by, Enrique sank deeper and deeper into the riverbank. The older women of the village took pity on him and brought him food and drink. But the men made no effort to assist him. The women prayed for him. He cried and pleaded and begged to be helped, but he only sank further into the earth. He sank to his waist, then to his chest. He could be heard at night yelling and crying for his mother to break him loose. He screamed and cried, but it helped him none. He sank to his neck. After several weeks, he disappeared into the sandy earth, screaming, only screaming until the earth swallowed him. They marked his final resting place with an old wooden stake. Some nights, even today, he could still be heard screaming from the river's edge. Have you ever thought about stealing something? Well, sometimes when you steal something, you get more than you bargained for. The dead man's shoes. Deep in the interior of Chihuahua, there is the quiet town of Parral, located in a small valley surrounded by soft, rolling hills. In the orange glow of the evening sky, the sun was slowly sinking. It had been a long, hot day for Ringo. Because he walked with a slight limp, he had been nicknamed Rengo, or Cripple, by the townspeople. Nobody knew his real name. He was a quiet, hard-working man who traveled daily to the marketplace to sell his pottery. His feet felt very heavy as he headed home this particular day. Because he was tired and worn out as he walked beside the town cemetery, he decided to take a shortcut through it. A peaceful, mysterious gloom permeated the area. The long shadows of the tombstones were beginning to fall across the path. They looked like guardians for the deceased, standing tall and proud, facing the last gleaming rays of the sun, the guardians of the graves, protecting those who had gone recently or long before. Rengo was too tired to be bothered by his surroundings. All he could think about was getting home to a warm meal and his pulque, the treasured liquor that quenched his thirsty soul, a magic elixir that kept his worn-out body going. Daydreaming, Rengo stumbled off the path and lost his footing, falling sideways with his heavy load. He hit the ground with a thump, sending clouds of dust in every direction. "Ay, Chihuahua," he cried out as he rolled down a small embankment. Stretched out in the dust, waiting to regain his senses, Rengo saw that his bundle of pottery had rolled in front of him. He knew that some of the pottery must have broken. "What bad luck," he muttered, while he waited for the cloud of dust to settle. He raised himself up, walked over to his bundle of pottery, and started to drag it over the embankment when suddenly he spotted a pair of dusty shoes at the foot of a grave. He let go of his bundle and went to inspect the shoes. A smile crossed his face. "Almost like new," he said out loud in his happiness, swatting the shoes one against the other to dust them off. Then he put the shoes down and started to slap the dust from his clothes. It was starting to get dark. He quickly picked up the shoes and placed them inside his pottery bundle, tied it up securely, placed it on his back, and headed up the embankment to the path with his limping walk. "Oh, what luck to find a pair of shoes in such an unusual place," he said. He was happy as he limped along the path, talking to himself. "But I'll have to separate the broken pottery from the good when I get home. Such bad luck to have fallen down and dropped my pottery. There will be less to sell tomorrow." His mind dwelled on the material things in life, for every cent he made helped him in his daily struggle to live. His was a hand-to-mouth existence. His stomach rumbled. "I'm hungry. I have to get home." Suddenly, he thought he heard a voice behind him in the distance. "Please, sir, my shoes. My feet are cold, por favor." He turned and looked around. There was no one. He looked at the bushes and the trees along the path, but he saw no one in the darkness. Was it a voice? Maybe it was just his rumbling stomach. Onward he went at a quicker pace. He would hurry home to satisfy his growing hunger. And as he reached the road at the edge of the cemetery, he once again thought he heard the voice, "Señor, mis zapatos, my shoes." He did not bother to look back. Instead, he quickly headed toward the crossroad that would take him home. "What a long, long day that has been," he told himself as he limped down the dusty road, leaving the cemetery far behind. When he arrived home, he sat down and he put his load on the ground and headed for the water pump. He took off his hat and pumped water into the bucket. He bent over, got some water into his cupped hands, and washed his hands, face, and neck to get all of the dust off. He walked into his home and placed the shoes he had just found on a mantle. Then he went to the kitchen, got his pot of beans and his corn tortillas, and walked over to the glowing fire. He put his bean pot on it and warmed his tortillas. Soon the comforting aroma of beans and corn filled the air. He peeled a couple of garlic cloves and mashed them with dried red peppers in a stone metate. He then drew in a small tomatillo for good measure and ground it up in the mixture and added a little water to make a little salsa. He poured the chili mash into a small dish and set it aside. He poured his frijoles into a bowl and sat down to enjoy his meal. "Qué delicioso, what a delicious meal," he almost yelled. He ripped his corn tortillas into little scoops, filled them with beans and chile as he greedily munched and swallowed everything with a swig of pulque. "I feel so good," he said, finishing his meal and quietly beginning to go over the things that had happened to him that day. "La Llorona is dancing for me tonight," he observed about the dancing shadows as they cast on his adobe walls. Then returning to his original thoughts, he commented, "Well, the day was not wasted after all. Some of the pottery is broken, but I also found a good pair of shoes I can sell." A sound interrupted his thoughts. It sounded like a voice somewhere outside the house. "Señor, por favor, mis zapatos, my shoes, please." Rengo's eyes opened wide. He stood up with a jolt. What was that sound? It was probably the wind blowing outside, he reassured himself. "I'm tired and I keep thinking I hear voices. It's just my tired mind and my tired body," he told himself again. He headed for the adobe stairs that led up to his bedroom, and as he passed by the mantle, he grabbed the shoes. Tomorrow is another day, he told himself, going slowly up the stairs. He was so tired that he had to struggle to make it up the 10 steps to his bedroom stairs. He hobbled into his room. sat on his bed, and placed the shoes on a small table next to the bed. He took off his old leather sandals and lay down, too weary to light his candle. He pulled the covers over his tired body, wondering what type of day tomorrow would be. Rengo was a poor Indian. His treasure was his soul rather than his material possessions. His bed was nothing but an old wooden frame with a mat and a thin mattress over it, and his covers were an old blanket and a sarape. As he lay in his bed listening to the wind blowing across the window, he thought he heard a funny noise. My shoes, mis zapatos, the sound seemed to be saying. But he didn't pay much attention. He was too tired. The lids closed over his eyes, and he drifted into a merciful sleep, a temporary escape from the pains and suffering of this world. A door creaked downstairs, and a huge shadow came into the house and dragged itself towards the stairs. The dark figure stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking upward. There it stood, staring. Finally, it dragged one leg up the first step, still looking upward. Then it dragged itself to the second step. "Thief, where are my shoes?" the dark shadow said, moaning softly. The shadow climbed to the third step, ever so slowly. All was quiet except for the snoring of the sleeping man upstairs. It struggled up to the fourth step, then to the fifth. The eyes of the huge, ghostly figure were glowing red in the dark. It was mad, very mad. Rengo had stolen its shoes. There was no excuse for stealing anyone's shoes. The monstrous figure crept up to the sixth step, moaning softly. It stopped and looked upward as if it were expecting someone to appear at the top of the steps. "Where are my shoes?" it moaned, dragging itself up one more step, the seventh step. Up in the bedroom, the shoes sat on the table next to the bed. Rengo was asleep, and the rising and lowering of his chest the only sign that he was alive. The shadowy figure moved heavily and sluggishly on the stairs up to the eighth step. "Adonde están mis zapatos? Where are my shoes?" it moaned. The huge shadow made it up to the ninth step. Its red eyes glowed with hatred. Its body trembled with the struggle of making it up one more last step. At last, the ghost dragged itself up to the 10th and final step, turned its head towards the bedroom door, and stared as it started to creep slowly toward Rengo's room. "Where are my shoes? ¿Adonde están mis zapatos?" The huge shadow reached the door to Rengo's room and pushed it open. It shoved itself inside. Then it stood still by the side of the bed where Rengo slept and looked down at the old man. There it stood, staring and occasionally glancing at the shoes that sat on the table. Asleep, Rengo was not aware of the mortal danger that stood next to him. Outside, the wind blew across the wind, howling, while the cold, silvery light of the moon cast a grim shadow across the sleeping man. Slowly, the huge figure bent over Rengo. It grabbed the sleeping man by the throat and pulled him upward with one violent motion. With Rengo dangling in midair, the ghost picked up the shoes and started back out the door. A terrified Rengo struggled to free himself from the dead man's grip, with no success. The ghost's grasping hands was like a vice that would not let him go. Rengo could hardly breathe, much less scream. He struggled and struggled as a dead man started down the stairs, dragging himself and Rengo down. The next day, when the villagers went searching for Rengo, they found a new trail that led to the cemetery. It looked as if someone had been dragged all the way to the graveyard. The trail stopped by an old grave. They never found Rengo again. Have you ever been mean to anyone? You as a little boy, little girl, have you ever treated an elderly person mean? Always be careful who you're mean to. You never know who they're going to be or what they're going to do. The next story is the water curse. Listen carefully. Gather round. There was an old lady in the barrio who was a local folk healer. She was known for her cures and her prophecies. She was very respected by the gente in the community. One day while she was walking home along the pothole dirt road, she spotted two young boys throwing stones at a fence with a knothole in one of the boards. They were missing the hole and the stones were making a popping noise as they bounced off the fence. The dog behind the fence was barking furiously at the young gentleman. The old lady stopped and called them over. "Hey, muchachos, come here, both of you." They stopped throwing their stones and sheepishly walked over to her in a lazy, uncaring manner. "What do you want, lady?" The old lady stared at them with a serious expression on her face that scared them a little. They felt very uncomfortable and a slight tremor shook their bodies. "What are your names?" "My name is Chava," one boy spoke up. "And this is Chino, my cousin." She snapped at him. "You shouldn't be throwing rocks at that fence and bothering the dog. I'm going to talk to your parents about this." Then she walked over to Chino and pointed her walking stick at him. "And you, why do you stare at me? I know you, Chinito. I remember the day you were born. You have the curse of the water on you. Stay away from the river. Your mother was cursed by the witches of the water before you were born, so be careful. Avoid the river and always be on guard. You carry that curse. Beware, Chinito. You are still young and you do not understand these things, so beware." Chino and Chava laughed at her. They slowly turned around and ran away laughing, and you could hear her voice saying, "Bad boys, muchachos malcriados." The boys ran down the road toward the river. Beside the road, they grabbed the branches of the pepper tree, pulled on them, and released them. The branches snapped away with a fast swinging motion, crashing upward in the other branches so that leaves and berries fell on their head. The boys ran to a place where a sandbar dammed the swirling waters of the San Gabriel River, forming a large pond. A green mantle of watercress covered the serene waters of the pond, and the large cottonwood trees on the riverbank cast dark shadows over the waters, while the killdeer birds flew over the river screeching, "Little, little." From the bank, the boys tried to skip stones across the pond into the river, but the watercress would catch the stones. Then the stones were swallowed by the pond. Bored with their game, Chava suggested to Chino that they go catch crawfish in the watercress, and after rolling up their pant legs, they entered the water and eased their way slowly among the watercress. At their approach, the small minnows that swam in the shallow waters of the pond, knee-deep in most places, ran away. Chino and Chava were having a great time. They would each capture a crawfish and wade out of the water to the top of the riverbank. There they would release them to see which one would move faster toward the water. They had fun watching and laughing as the crawfish moved, stopped, quickly crawled again towards the water's edge, and then darted into the watercress, tail first. The boys continued their game for the second time. Then they tired and headed out of the water. Suddenly, something grabbed Chino by the leg, and the startled boy tried to shake it loose. He struggled and struggled with no success, managing only to fall into the pond. "Help me, Chava, help me!" Chino cried out to his cousin, so scared that he started to cry. "Something has grabbed my leg and won't let me go." Excited and scared, Chava leaped into the pond and took hold of Chino's arms. But hard as Chava pulled, he could not break Chino loose from whatever was dragging him away. Help me, Chava called out in vain for someone to come help him rescue Chino. In response, the killdeer birds filled the air with excited cries, as if sensing the desperate struggle that was taking place, the daily struggle between life and death that is part of life. Chino continued twisting and kicking with his one free leg as he tried to free himself. In the meantime, Chava kept pulling and screaming for help. But Chava, after all, just a small boy, and he was weakening. Finally, he lost his grip and broke away from Chino. Now Chino flailed, his arms grabbing handfuls of watercress and his screams piercing the air. The force was slowly dragging him to where the water was deeper, to the deepest part of the pond. Chava, with water up to his chest, could no longer reach out to his cousin. All he can do was stand there helplessly and watch. Suddenly, Chino's body was jerked viciously downward. His screams were silenced as he was pulled violently into the water. The watercress and water swirled angrily over the spot where he disappeared. Bubbles of air came bursting into the surface. Then there was only silence. The ripples died out as the last bubbles burst on the surface of the water. The watercress was broken all the way to the spot where Chino had disappeared. Chava stood there in the watercress with tears streaming down his cheeks. His body shuddered as his sobbing came bursting out from his chest. He moved out of the water, pushing the watercress from him as he made his way to the bank. He walked up the riverbank, sat down sobbing, stared through his tearful eyes at the hole in the watercress, the spot in the pond where Chino was last seen. Then he picked himself up and headed home. Later, the men from the barrio came with torches to search the pond. They tore down the sandbank to the empty water of the pond into the river, but they could not find Chino's body. Inexplicably, no trace of the boy was ever found. Only the old witch understood what had taken place in that watercress-covered pond by the San Gabriel River. These ignorant people, the old woman thought. They don't realize that along with their ancestors, they are to blame for what happened to the little boy. These people accepted the gods of the Spaniards, she said to herself, neglecting the gods of their ancestral Indian fathers, neglecting to offer them that which they demanded and received in the old days. For centuries, the gods who had looked after them waited in vain for a sacrifice or an offering while the sons and daughters of the old burned candles and sweet incense to their new god, praying to him in a strange tongue and singing foreign melodies. The forgotten dioses decided to exact revenge. They sent the mother of the earth and the waters, Cuaticle, the goddess from which all things were born, to demand a forgotten tribute from the poor gente. She came with the vengeance to grab the sacrificial victim herself. The gods had waited centuries for an offering and would not wait any longer. They would now return and start the rituals again. The victims chosen would be born with the water curse on their souls, and the witch knew what happened, but she would not tell the people. Now in the summer, when the watercress is in bloom, the people from the barrio, seeing the white gleaming mantles of flowers that covered what is left of the pond, call it Chino's shroud. Be careful. Ten cuidado.